Pali word for the worlds we create in our mind is bhava. Literally means becoming. We keep creating them. And if you look at dependent core rising, they're based on two things. The immediate prerequisite is clinging, upadana. And clinging in turn is based on craving, tanha. But it's interesting to note that both of those words have another meaning. The word for clinging can also mean feeding, taking sustenance. And tanha means thirst. The mind is thirsting for things. And so it latches on the five aggregates and tries to feed off them. In this case, feeling, perception, thought constructs. These are the things we feed on. What we're doing as we're meditating is to create a good bhava, a good place for the mind to stay in the present moment. If you create a world for yourself that maintains its reference to the present, then it's a lot easier to see what else is going on in the present as well. In other words, you can see the process as it's happening. And that enables you to see through it, so you don't get misled by these worlds that you create. When you create worlds of the past and the future, though, you have to block out large parts of your awareness, so you can stay focused on that little world. That's why they're not helpful in the meditation. They're helpful to the extent that you remember things you did in the past, or you can anticipate the future in ways that help focus you back on the present. In other words, you can see times when you were mindless, not very alert. And you can reflect on the damage it caused. Or you can reflect on the dangers that await you in the future if you're not mindful and alert. This kind of thinking is helpful because it helps motivate you to get back to the present moment, to develop your powers of alertness, to develop your powers of mindfulness. But if you want to see the process in action, you've got to watch in the present moment. So you create the world out of the breath, the sense of the body. Take the sensations that you feel in the legs and the arms, etc., and try to create them into a basis for concentration. A place where the mind can stay, where you can have as your dwelling. And then a sense of ease that you can develop through the breath. Even a sense of fullness you can develop from the breath. That helps to alleviate your thirst and gives you something to feed on. The texts actually talk about feeding on rapture. In the midst of a world of hungry people, the Buddha says, we feed on rapture like the radiant gods. And he's not just talking about hungry in the sense of hungry for physical food. I mean, you look at what's going on in the world. You read the newspapers, the news magazines, and you see what people are doing from their sense of psychological hunger. And it's not a pretty sight. So when we say that in the midst of hungering people, we're feeding on rapture like the radiant gods, it's not a selfish or narrow pleasure. We're trying to get ourselves out of that feeding frenzy. So this is one of the processes we have to understand in the mind. How does this happen? The Buddha says there are 4 ways of feeding inside. One is simply feeding in the sense of sensual pleasure, sensual desire. You can think about situations that you would like to have in your life that would make you feel pleasant, that you would derive some pleasure from. You can think about times in the past when you had pleasures you anticipate in the future, and the mind does feed off of that. There's also feeding on views, clinging to views. And then, as you probably noticed, there's a strong sense of me or mine around the clinging to that particular, feeding on that particular kind of thing. I'm the person who has the right views. I'm the person who has views, understand things better than other people. My take on things is right. And there's feeding on certain ways of doing things. It's called precepts and practices. A particular way of doing things is the right way of doing things in and of itself. I mean, some of these things are part of the path. You have to have views for the path. You have to have certain precepts and practices for the path. What the Buddha criticized was the people who feed on these things as ends in and of themselves. And then finally there's feeding on ideas of who you are, your self-identity. And why does the mind feed on these things? Because it feels empty without them. Sometimes it feels lost without them. Where are your bearings? And we create our bearings for ourselves by our views, by our ways of doing things. What it comes down to is we feel that we need these things for pleasure, need these things for happiness, and without them we feel lost. These are our means, we think, for attaining pleasure. It's based on that thirst. The thirst for pleasure, the thirst for being, or the thirst to destroy what we've got. But all these things are motivated by that desire for happiness, by that desire for well-being. The thirst, in turn, is motivated by feelings of pleasure or pain, or neither, sort of a dull, neutral feeling. And these come from sensory contact. And so one way of looking at the processes in the mind is try to trace them back. Exactly what contact triggered them? Was there a thought? Was there a sound? Was there an idea that suddenly triggers you into creating these worlds? That's one thing you've got to look for. What are the triggers? And you find that the triggers can be very small sometimes. But dependent co-arising digs deeper than that. It says it's not just the contact. We come to sensory contact with a lot of preconceived notions, a lot of issues, ready to pounce on things. That's why contact is not the beginning of dependent co-arising. Prior to contact, you've got the senses, and prior to the senses, you've got name and form. Name and form are crucial here, particularly name. It includes feelings, perceptions, intentions, attention, and the contact among these things in the mind. This is why the Buddha focuses the practices of the path right here. So you've got to change your intention. You've got to change the way you understand things. Our basic approach for happiness is there are things that you identify with, your sense of who you are. Who's going to benefit from these activities that you're doing to create happiness? And exactly what things do you have under your power, under your control, that you can use to create that happiness? That's an issue of attention. How you attend to things.